Hi, Kerry here again. Now, I just want to go and describe one of the more pleasurable rabbit holes of reading I went down last year, 2020, and that is the Unreliable Memoir series by Clive James. Now, if you're of a similar age to me and live in one of the Commonwealth nations, you probably first heard of Clive James in the 1980s when he appeared on our television screens, fronting shows like Saturday Night Clive. Here, the topical news segments were always months out of date, but James's wit and charm always shone through as he introduced us to weird and wonderful television from around the globe and interviewed the famous and eccentric alike. In the 1990s, he continued to grace our screens as he travelled the globe, producing the postcard from documentaries and various other similar efforts. But who was this jovial man and where did he spring from? I had an inkling that he had careers beyond TV. I'd seen books with his name on them in the shops and in the library, but it wasn't until his death in late 2019 and the ensuing obituaries and tributes that I really looked into his efforts beyond the screen. And I found he had been a critic, a poet, a novelist, a songwriter, and much, much more. And most fondly recorded from his written output was his autobiographical works, the so-called Unreliable Memoirs. Now, these books came out starting in 1980 with the original Unreliable Memoirs. And in 1985, he produced a second volume, Falling Towards England. And in 1990, a third volume, Mayweathers and Juniors, was released. And around 2001, his publisher Picador produced an omnibus edition of all three called Always Unreliable. And that's the version that I read the first three volumes in. And it also includes a new introduction by Clive James, stressing about how unreliable the contents actually were. He had changed a lot of names and places and situations, but in the later books he decided against that and he started to use the people's real names, and he wasn't afraid to call a spade a spade. Now, there was a long break then until the fourth volume, The North Face of Soho, that was published in 2006. Then the final volume, The Blaze of Obscurity, came out in 2009. Now, in that book, he hinted of a sixth volume, but unfortunately that has never appeared. I've never heard if he actually started writing it before his death, but so far nothing has come from his publishers about that. So looking over the volumes, the first Unreliable Memoirs covers his birth in 1939, right at the start of World War II, to his late teens in Australia. He was born in suburban Australia, near Sydney. His birth name was actually Vivian James, but he chose Clive later on as a name to go by. A major event when he was about 5 years old was that his father, who fought in the Pacific War and had been captured by the Japanese, was being transported home by American flyers, and the plane actually crashed in a storm, killing his father and all those on board. Now, James always said that this was a defining moment in his life, and everything he did since then was kind of altered by the death of his father that he hardly ever knew. Now, Unreliable Memoirs covers his life with his mother, who had quite a handful bringing him up, his school days and his early university days. The book ends as he leaves Australia for England on a ship in the early 1960s. The second volume, Falling Towards England, shows us England in the early 60s, 1962 and onward. It's kind of contrast to what you usually think of England in the 60s, the swinging and London and all that. It's more of a gritty, down-to-earth look at life among the less well-off. Clive James tries to find work, so he has a grand plan of working a menial job during the day and writing at night. Now, this doesn't quite come off. He's unable to hold down a job for very, very long, and he's perennially short of money and needs help from his expat friends over there. He decides to try and get help from a friend to enter Cambridge University. He has friends in high places there, and they manage to secure a place for him. But he discovers the money he needs from the UK government is only available if he's lived in England for at least 2 years. So he has to live a menial existence, scrubbing for money, and that goes on, and that's how the book ends. Now, the third book Mayweathers and Juniors continues his life in England in the 60s, but it narrows the focus into his time at Cambridge University. He gets a place at Pembroke College, starts studying English and philosophy, etc. And but he's seduced by the Footlight Society, the famous entertainment society that operates in Cambridge. And he becomes quite a well-known figure amongst the entertainment set, and his academic studies suffer as a result. He's said that he gets good marks, but he doesn't read the right books, and he eventually drops out of college. The book ends as he gets married to one of his many girlfriends. He seems to go through quite a few during the earlier books. And then we jump forward to the North Face of Soho. Now that basically covers his life as a journalist, reviewer, critic. Early on gets a job reviewing radio for the Listener magazine. The only trouble is that he doesn't actually ever listen to radio, so that kind of goes by the by. Eventually gets a high-profile job as a TV critic for the Observer newspaper, and that's where he finds his feet, basically. He becomes extremely popular as a critic, and he starts writing literary criticism and all sorts of other written material. He describes the culture and the lifestyle of the era very well. He's part of like an intellectual generation which a lot of them Australians, which kind of fueled the fire of the cultural change going on in the late 60s and early 70s, and he's no small part of that, but he stayed a little back from the mainstream at that time. Now, and Blades of Obscurity basically covers his role as a television producer and presenter. Starting in the late 70s, he increasingly took on bit parts on television productions, and then in the 80s he became a full-time presenter with Clive James on television, and then Saturday Night Clive and other similar programs. At the same time, he was transposing his work on travel journalism from the written word to the television, and that's where the postcard from programs came. It became a bit of a subject of a bidding war between the two main British broadcasters, BBC and ITV, and he switched back and forth between them as the offers got better or worse. And he sets up his own production company, becomes his own boss, becomes very successful, and then around the turn of the century he steps away from it all. The year 2000 look back program was his last job in television, and he walked away from it all and went back to writing. And he has a love of poetry, which he managed to take up again. He wrote several major works. Blades of Obscurity really ends with the end of his television career. He hints at a further volume, like I said, but that never came about. And in the 2010s, he was diagnosed with leukemia and emphysema and some kidney problems. He wasn't given much time to live, but he actually lived up until 2019 in November. He was quite a great man. That's all we can really say about him. There's more to him than meets the eye. He did seem a bit of an awful cheeky chappy around town sometimes, but he climbed the mountain of intellectual activity like few others that are around these days. So that's my look at his Unreliable Memoirs. And it's also a note to know, on researching this video, I discovered that you can now get, if you're in the UK, a Kindle edition, the complete Unreliable Memoirs that contains all 5 books. So if you're interested in him, that would be the one to get. So thank you for your time today, and I hope you enjoyed the video.